Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Have I got any hustlers at the back there? No? Well, I think you'll find that was two stimulating talks that we've had this evening, ranging from urban rugs on carpets of landscape to the virtues of terraced houses. Great.
And I wonder if many of these projects have in common that they're all perhaps in Labour communities, Labour wards or councils, and therefore I just wonder whether you think this is, do we have a political dimension which affects the ability to do these kinds of projects in more conservative communities that are dominated by a different political dimension?
I think both of you should answer this, so I'm going to ask Jason to take it first and then Glenn.
Being in a conservative, dominated conservative part of the country.
I mean, I think that we both finished off talking not about housing, but the communities that define or are defined by those master plans, those layouts. I think that yes, inevitably that there's a political aspect to that, but I don't think that the ingredients that we were talking about probably vary from one place to another. Although I suppose we work in Labour and Conservative-dominated boroughs, and they have the same aspiration of placemaking, but how they then establish an attitude perhaps towards density and height is different, and that's a challenge. But I think the work that we do predominantly in London is probably similar in terms of the densities that we're looking at, because I think there is a need in the areas that we work to provide homes. That we do have a climate crisis, but we've also got a housing crisis, and the way to do that is through addressing issues of density.
And Glenn, on the political side, your experience of where you've worked?
I think your question was, all the projects that we showed seem to be from Labour areas. And so would they work in Conservative areas? Was that the question?
That's a comment saying yes. Firstly, were they in Labour?
Well, it's an interesting one. I've been sat here trying to think it through. I think in Birmingham, it's a Labour-controlled city, but it's changed from being Conservative during the process, during the life of some of those projects. And I think actually the urban question, and we've got, by the way, we've got a Conservative mayor called Andy Street, who's brilliant. So it's a very mixed bag. So let me just talk about Birmingham. I think the same challenge, if you've got Andy Street here, and then you've got Ian Ward, the Labour leader, they would both be saying exactly the same. I sat to a conference with the Metro mayors, which was Andy Burnham, Michael Heseltine, Andy Street, and I've forgotten the other one. And it was brilliant because they all complemented each other, and they said their vision for our cities was identical, that you couldn't actually get any difference between their vision for making successful cities. And Birmingham, we've got very affluent areas which Andy Street's in control of, such as, Edgbaston and other areas, and it goes all the way down to Solihull, where we're working. And so their view, and I sort of agree with it, is the real challenge is seeing above the 5-year term and the short-termism of political engagement and coming up with a project which is going to have to be there for 20 or 30 years, and getting the infrastructure and the investment and the support, knowing that you'll have to pass the baton to another administration. The real challenge we've got is short-term politics. It's not the colour of the politics, it's the tenure of politics.
Can I ask other questions, please? Gentleman there.
Thank you, gentlemen. Some lovely pieces of work you described tonight. I'd like to ask you, though, about amenities. I'm thinking about schools, playing fields, shops, pubs. In areas, for example, which might require a car to access them, what are your thoughts about amenities? And in particular, not so much for design, but showing my ignorance here, where does thinking about the need for what amenities a site might need? What are the drivers from that? Where do the ideas of, where all those additional things which makes life in a community worthwhile, what are the drivers for all that happening?
Glenn, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, amenities, i.e. all the other things apart from housing, which could be shops or schools, parks. Where do they fit into the story of projects like we've been showing you?
Who's pushes for those to happen?
Well, it's funny, when I started out doing this 30 years ago, it was with the local authorities. Some of the best developers we work with now realise that they're not going to be able to have successful commercial developments, and people won't buy into them unless they've got the right mix of things. King's Cross was amazingly successful, in my view, because they got the amenities right. It's what happens at ground floor, getting the University of the Arts in, getting all those marvellous cafes and bars in, then added value, which then means you get Google and you get other people wanting to be above them. Nothing works better than having the right ground floor and the right amenity there. And I think Argent, who were brilliant, they put a 15% premium on their values if you got the public realm, parks and outside spaces. So I think it's absolutely essential. And it's no longer that it's a planning tax. Smart developers do it because it's good business.
And Jason, who leads the amenities on the projects that you've been working?
Interestingly, there's another joint client, Hadley, for example, who we're working together on different projects. But as you're saying, that they recognise that to create a successful development, they need successful places that they're going to generate, and they will only work if they have all the amenities.
Sorry, who was they?
In this particular example, it's Hadley Properties, who are a developer. Yeah. Interestingly, it isn't just the developers, although they recognise that actually by investing that they create good places to live, and if you've got good places to live, that's going to be a good reason to have homes to go with them. On a number of projects, and interestingly, there's been a debate about the demise of the libraries. And actually, a lot of the private developers see the value of actually reintroducing libraries into developments and actually broadening the offer of those. So they're not just about books, there's about meeting places where you can interact with the council and pay your taxes, as well as, the conversation we were having is what could this, actually starting with a blank canvas and saying, what do we think people might want in that space, whether it's a cinema or whether it's a library. And actually, I suppose the other thing that we're now focusing on is moving towards sort of a post-COVID placemaking, where that you're working, even if it's on the sort of periphery, the suburbs of London, from my experience, actually making places where people can work, maker spaces, things that perhaps have kind of in the past been lost, but you've got opportunities for artists, designers, makers, and there are businesses that are set up around that. So in another project in Newham at the Royal Docks, where we've got sort of a temporary use, which is run by a company who invites all of the creatives into that to create that sense of space and place and neighbourhood from the outset.
Just coming back to you, Glenn, trying to answer the gentleman's question of the green spaces, the public amenity spaces. Who is leading that in your projects? How much there is, where it's located?
There's a deal to be done at the outset between the amount of open space, and because land is valuable, and so the all the developers need to keep an eye on the amount of space versus developable land. But again, I think once the numbers are established early on through negotiation, and then it is about how then you distribute that. We only want to work with developers who've got long-term commitment and are not quick in and out merchants. We don't. We've been doing it long enough. We don't get any pleasure out of working for year-end developers who just need to turn a profit, go into somewhere, do the project, take the money, and then do something else. So the people we're fortunate enough to be working with, and Jason's the same, is people who've got a long-term commitment, and they only get the deal with the local authority because they've got a track record and a commitment, and there's a stewardship and a commitment to the place.
Another question? Gentleman in the middle here.
Hi there. Thomas Elsmore, a local property developer. So my question for you is sort of how has COVID shone a light on some of the problems in housing? So, for example, we found that a lot of housing is not fit for purpose now, to ability to work from home, to these open plan houses that are wonderful in the beginning become quite chaotic when you're trying to work from home and you've got kids running around. Is there anything that's sort of shone a light in your practice that you'll be bringing forward?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're working with a lot of housing associations who actually, as you were saying, are in it for the long term, 18 years, and understand that there will be patterns of living which are going to change. And I think it is really interesting that sort of, the sort of move away from perhaps the open plan. I mean, as long as the open plan is truly long life, loose fits, then that's fine. And actually having the opportunity, if you can, to subdivide those spaces, as long as the buildings and the plans are inherently flexible, then that's fine. But we are looking at other aspects of how the spaces in between the main rooms, for example, can be used in different, more flexible ways. But I think that there's so that's within the within the home, but actually looking at whether they're coming back to what we were saying about the sort of suburban place making, which actually provides sort of co-working opportunities and making that part of the ingredients that actually makes that a viable development.
Glenn, do you want to add?
I agree with everything you said. Just at a different scale, we're working in Edgeware at the moment in North London. It was created in 1920s when the tube station was open there. And I've seen the pictures, the posters were move out, and it was just after the Spanish flu, move out of the diseased city and move to the suburbs where we've got clean air. It's come, 100 years almost to the day, and we're working back on it, and we've got the same circumstances. So the thing which I think I've noticed is this yearning to have access to, not have to be on the underground system, to have access to the countryside, and the suburbs all of a sudden, and places like Guildford have got a new meaning, I think.
Yeah, I found that, and I've been living in Guildford for the last 5 years, and I think community has been the biggest thing. I sort of highlighted it. And I think, interestingly, a lot of your house types are a lot of front doors. So we live in a small development, 6 flats and 8 houses, and the car park is actually the most communal area because it's the crisscross of everyone's paths. And I think that's been quite an interesting thing where you think at first, oh, it's this a car park? But actually, I often put the bins out, and normally about half an hour later, because I've spoken to a few neighbours, including Alistair.
Well, it's the social interaction. It's very, very important.
I think that's what's so missing. And my concern for these high density areas that sometimes in London you can walk past thousands of people, yet no one. But it seems that you have the kind of, as you said, the Goldilocks with these densities where people are actually interacting with their neighbours and knowing their kids, and it's interesting. It's good work. Thank you.
Okay, can we take some more questions? Gentleman on the left there.
Question about cars. I noticed cars, very few actually, in any of the pictures that we've seen. Whether there was an agreed strategy on cars, so what provision would be there, how you get cars in and out. So there were some cars which were in parking spaces below houses with no evidence of how they actually get there or get out again. Or was it expected that the development would be self-selecting, so people who move in there would have a lifestyle that would fit having a car which is maybe not so accessible or just not used so much?
Jason, could you answer that with Accordia to start with?
Yeah, I mean, Accordia is an interesting example where most of the developments, or all of the developments that we both have worked on, is prioritising people over cars. So it's firstly, Accordia is probably not the best example in terms of density, but the way that those cars are managed, the shared surfaces that actually move away from the car dominance is key in terms of developing the landscape and the language of the spaces between the buildings. With Accordia, they are within the footprint of the building. But even the way that, all of the projects that we've worked on, we're trying not to express those and to provide those front doors which are for humans rather than for cars. So that's what we're trying to achieve. But in terms of the politics, I suppose, again, there's a move away from the reliance on cars, but you have to work in an environment where we have sufficient public transport, and that needs to work hand in hand with those two things. So the One Brighton project, which is, as I say, is quite early doors in terms of that, we came to the project with the idea of not having any cars because actually it's so well connected. So that section I showed you, there are buses, there's the national transport. There's a car club, there's a bike club, and there's a disabled parking, but nothing more. But before, it was one at the time. It was one of the most successful developments in that area. It was sold out before any of the other properties along the road, not because of the cars, but actually because of the community that it represented.
Cars are the hardest bit. Yeah. So it's they are really hard. Because if you've got a family and they've got 3 cars, and on the development that we're building, you can't afford to tuck them underneath because it costs too much money and it wouldn't stack up. You have to probably, at Port Loop, it's a bit, if you go on a Saturday and everyone's not working and everyone's there's maybe cars parked all over the place and it looks a bit scruffy. On the next phase, we're managing to hide some of the cars because of the levels in a very cost-effective way. But it's the biggest challenge, and ultimately, we've got to wean ourselves off having 2 or 3 cars per household. But it's difficult, isn't it? It is really difficult, because when you move out from an apartment and you've got a couple and they've got a family and then they've got to pick up kids at different times, there's a point in your life you need 2 cars. So I think it's actually coming up with solutions, especially in areas such as Guildford and in some of the suburbs that we're working in, where you've actually just got to keep the cars on the street. I'm not that squeamish about Victorian. I live in a Victorian district at the moment, and there's cars on the streets, and some of them are up on the pavement. But it's better than car courts, in my view, and having all sorts of complicated solutions, which means when we do have less cars, Victorian streets, 12-metre wide streets, can absorb a lot of cars, and they sort of work. I think that's better than building loads of clumsy car parking solutions, which you're then stuck with.
Other questions this side? Gentleman at the end of the row.
Hello, I'm Nick Allen from Guildford Society. Thank you, Jason and Glenn, for a fantastic presentation and showing us some really great schemes. In making schemes of this quality, I suppose my question is about, behind those schemes, how much of it is about the client and a brief? How much of it is planning policies and the planning, authority, the planners? And how much of it is funding and these projects being well funded, or is it a mix of all those? You mentioned people like Urban Splash. Obviously, you with clients like that, you're pushing it open door, but other times, possibly not.
Well, they've got no money, and they're building in Leeds, and they're building in Sheffield, and they're building in areas such as poor parts of Birmingham. And there's no real sort of, Homes England have started, they put in the infrastructure, Homes England interesting organisation under Peter Freeman. So they've got a remit to prepare land and to help fertilise the conditions where house builders can make money by doing local. But so money's not the thing. How do we get the best results? It's having developers who are in it for more than just a quick return. Yeah, that's who actually have got a huge amount of pride in doing it, and they get out of bed not to make a lot of money, but to actually, they're excited at the idea that they're leaving something behind far better. And then we enjoy working with other architects and other designers. I mean, nobody in our business goes out to become a millionaire. You don't. Yeah, you do it. You get other satisfactions. So I think actually it's getting a committed team where nobody wants to be the superhero on it, really, and getting the right balance, and then also realizing that it's probably going to be a 6 or 7 year project, and you're in it for a long haul. Yeah. It's getting to the point where you take your enjoyment seriously, you know. So we all get to know each other, and there will be difficulties. Most of the time, the planners are on board. If you get the right team, very rarely, I can't remember a housing scheme where we've had a refusal, because very soon the planners will realise this is a good opportunity for them to accomplish something that, if only they'd got the resources, they'd be doing. The big challenge with many of the local authorities, they haven't got the resources to do what planning ought to be doing, which is to thinking it through on a long-term basis. So often, the developers we work alongside do that work in partnership or for the local authority.
I completely agree. I mean, it is all of those things. But I think, it's probably that the projects that we've chosen to show you this evening are exemplars because we were attracted to the idea of that development, or with the Bioregional Quintain example, they came to us because of a reputation that we have in terms of sustainability. We've actually then adopted their way of thinking as well, and that's become a sort of a long-term story in terms of another thread of design, which is around a low-carbon economy. So that's a really fantastic story for us. In between those, there are some very straightforward, ordinary streets that just work very well. In terms of the interest of us now, we don't really talk about doing a housing development. We talk about placemaking. And so all of the ingredients that go together to make that work is something that, as you're saying, is a long-term process that we are, we're driven towards as architects who see that as a calling to create great neighbourhoods.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to take 2 more questions. We haven't had a ladies' question yet, so the lady on the right there.
Hello, Diana Kingdon for Green Oak Housing Association. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the passive ventilation you showed in an airtight home to avoid overheating, and how your chimneys actually assist with that.
Heat rises, and what we found in some of the houses we built before was that in a sealed building, the upstairs became very uncomfortable, and people didn't want to leave windows open because of security and other issues. So what we devised was some vents in a building that could be left open without compromising the security of the building at low level in the walls, and then the chimney could be opened. So what you ended up with was a bit like a termite hill, that it would draw air low level and it would purge the building in the summer of hot air. And so even when the building's not when people were not in the building, you had the opportunity to leave certain parts of it open, so it naturally ventilated. The buildings we do are not sealed. We don't like sealed buildings. So I'm a great fan of, in the winter you can close double glazed or triple glazed windows, but I think there's no substitute for having naturally ventilated buildings.
Yes, I mean, we've built some eco homes, probably now about 16, 17 years ago, and the first was using passive ventilation through roof lines. And then later schemes we tried with mechanical ventilation systems, but they have significant problems, and not least, I think, really in the maintenance and of them. So. But the idea of actually, rather than just having a roof light, actually having a chimney, you're saying that makes it more effective? I need to go and check how many of them have been used. I haven't been to that development for 5 years. So it would be interesting to go back and see if it works. But on other projects that we are designing now on Port Loop,
we're not using chimneys, but we are using a combination of natural ventilation at different heights, which can be, so the same principle, but using windows. I think the more I do this job, the more I try and keep things really, really simple. And you realise that Georgians and Victorian builders had got lots of, that they were doing things because they've got hundreds of years, many years of experience in doing them. So the thing about, thermal mass is another thing that we sort of lose on highly insulated, lightweight buildings. You lose out on the benefit of having a solid wall, which actually in the summer can also keep you cool. So there's lots of things that I think, that we are re-evaluating, which are traditional construction techniques, which are not high-tech at all. They're very low-tech. There's no mechanical, there's no electronics, there's no mechanical systems involved.
I mean, the first thing we actually ensured was that it was a fabric-first design.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason might want to just add to that question.
Yes, I mean, I think that as we showed right at the beginning, in terms of sustainability, that there's a story that's evolved, and we've responded in different ways and different times. And as you were saying, thermal mass can work incredibly well if you design the building from the outset to hit the targets that you want, which includes thermal mass. And we did the Woodland Trust building, which, interesting, is all made of wood, but it has these concrete radiators, which are actually lumps of concrete, which are the thermal mass, which are stuck on the ceiling. Slightly bizarre experience, but actually for exactly the reasons you're talking about, the need to retain some sort of level of thermal mass. There's obviously the story about passive house, and that's potentially a really good way of dealing with our energy issues. There's a lot, though, that goes with it, which is about education. And people understanding how they use buildings, so how we ventilate things, ventilate rooms. Interestingly, we did a project in Madrid, which was perhaps a slightly surprising, where we did exactly the same thing, where we had these chimneys. And I did go back, and it did work, which was I was very surprised that they hadn't been misused. They'd continued to understand how to use the system. But I think that it's about understanding the targets you're setting and the long-term effects that has. Passive houses, obviously, there's a cost attributed to that, but I'd like to think that, especially with the social housing providers, you're in it for the long term, and so there is a payback, and it might be 7 years. And I think that's the difficulty that we've got with developers, where they're not going to be able to realise that unless you're in a sort of build-to-rent environment. That can work. I think it's horses for courses, but actually really understanding what your target is, what you're trying to achieve, and allowing people to be in control as well. So purging of all rooms is important. That it's not that everyone's going to be sealed in. Certain environments it could work a lot better. However, in certain dense environments, noise and air quality can be addressed by the use of sort of heat recovery vent systems with, whether it's ground source heat pump or air source heat pump. The work that we've done showed that it's so incredibly efficient to provide energy in that way that I think it's worth continuing with, notwithstanding the things that your observations as well.
So I'm going to take one final question, and gentleman at the front had his hand up. Do you still want to ask the question?
Yes, if I may. Yeah. I probably don't need that. Okay, thanks. I was really James Burland. I'm a local guy, semi-retired architect, really, but places like Guildford that have a really good train line and are surrounded by green belt, which fingers right into the centre. They're under immense pressure for to let greenfield go to brownfield, and these sort of towns are trying to draw that in and say, let's intensify the town centre instead. So there's a lot of the dreaded word master planning, which incidentally I don't agree with either as a term. But it seems to me that the density question is more about intensity rather than density. So there's areas of Guildford with quite poorly constructed housing in terms of what we've got to do with climate change. And I wondered what you two thought about how you can go about keeping those communities and intensifying the developments, turning them into higher, more terraced and so on. What are your thoughts on that?
Jason, do you want to go first?
I don't know the areas that you're talking about specifically, but I suppose what we've worked on is working with councils where there are places that you don't need to tear up the neighbourhood and impose that master plan, and whether there are elements that can be inserted within that which actually are balanced to what's already there and reinforces the community in the neighbourhood. But again, without knowing the detail of the areas, I think that having a hybrid solution which ties in with existing buildings, retaining existing buildings. So although we've shown all new build, I think all of the projects that we've shown are new build. We also work in sort of creative reuse of buildings and finding ways to reinforce the sense of the history of that area and establishing an opportunity to identify an appropriate scale for the development too. But it is really difficult given the pressures in terms of what you're saying with, that if we don't develop certain areas of land, that actually then it has a knock-on effect further out, which erodes the sort of green belt, I suppose.
And final point, then.
I mean, I can think of all sorts of towns and cities where the Victorian stuff is intact and the pre-Victorian stuff you don't want to touch. But it's the stuff from 1950s and 60s and 70s and even some of the interwar, which is very low density, and it's not making great use of land, and it's actually, in Birmingham, some of the most troublesome, some of the most difficult neighbourhoods are the ones at the lowest density, because you don't end up with people walking. People don't feel necessarily safe because there's nobody walking around on the streets. And so we've done some exercises on some of those areas of Birmingham. If you can add in buildings in between the existing ones and take out certain buildings, and so you intensify low density, not very good housing estates which were thrown up after the Second World War, there is a real project in that, because then you can preserve the green areas which are of value. And what we're doing is an audit with Birmingham City Council on mapping some of those and finding out and doing a project where, so there's lots of too much dual carriageways going through housing. You don't need all that space. You sort of take some of the highway out. We overdid some of the infrastructure and road space given away, and non-specific open green space. Green verges on the sides of dual carriageways with a big verge down the middle of it. You know the places. And there's a lot of land tied up in that sort of in that underused territory that we could look at.